The rain in Chicago was not merely weather. It was a physical weight, a cold, suffocating shroud that clung to the jagged skyline and turned the asphalt of the South Side into a mirror of shattered neon and broken dreams. It was the kind of rain that blurred the lines between the living and the dead, a relentless downpour that hissed against the brickwork of tenement buildings like 1,000 angry whispers. Detective Elias Miller, a man whose soul felt as weathered and gray as the city he served, leaned against the damp interior of his unmarked sedan. The scent of stale coffee and old upholstery filled a cramped space, a familiar olfactory cocoon that offered no comfort. Elias was 55, though his joints claimed he was 80. He had spent 25 of those years chasing ghosts through these very streets, and tonight he was chasing the most elusive ghost of all, Jax. To the precinct, Jax was a high-priority target, a ghost hacker and a physical phantom who had breached the encrypted vaults of 3 major banks in as many months. But Elias knew there was more to the boy than the digital breadcrumbs he left behind. He had seen the security footage. Jax didn't spend the stolen millions on luxury cars or designer drugs. He spent it on anonymous donations to failing community centers and medical bills for families facing eviction. Unit 4 Bravo, I have eyes on the target. Elias rasped into his radio, his voice sounding like sandpaper on stone. He's heading into the old rail yard off 47th, moving on foot. Do not engage until backup arrives. I repeat, do not engage. But Elias knew backup was 10 minutes out, navigating the gridlock caused by a multi-car pileup on the Dan Ryan Expressway. And he knew Jax wouldn't wait 10 minutes. The boy was fast, a creature of adrenaline and instinct. Elias stepped out of the car, the rain immediately soaking through his wool overcoat. He felt a familiar ache in his lower back, a reminder of a bullet he'd taken in '09. But he pushed it aside. Tonight, the chase ended. He saw the flash of a dark hoodie darting between 2 rusted freight cars. Jax was nimble, vaulting over the coupling mechanisms with an effortless grace that made Elias's knees throb in sympathy. The rail yard was a graveyard of industrial ambition, a vast expanse of twisted steel and rotted timber that smelled of creosote and ancient oil. The sound of the rain hitting the hollow metal shells of the tankers created a discordant metallic symphony that masked the sound of Elias's heavy footsteps. "Stop, Jax," Elias shouted, his breath blooming in the frigid air. "There's nowhere left to go. The yard is bottled up." Jax didn't stop. He turned a corner, his sneakers splashing through deep, oil-slick puddles. He was headed for the Goliath warehouse, a massive, 5-story concrete monolith that had once processed the city's steel, but now stood as a crumbling monument to a forgotten era. The building loomed out of the fog like a Gothic fortress, its broken windows looking down like empty eye sockets. Elias drew his service weapon not to fire, but because the darkness of the warehouse demanded it. He followed Jax through a side entrance where the heavy steel door hung precariously on a single, rusted hinge. The interior of the Goliath was a vacuum of sound, save for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water leaking through the ceiling 5 floors above. The air was thick with the scent of wet dust and the metallic tang of oxidation. "I know why you do it, kid," Elias called out, his flashlight beam cutting a lonely path through the darkness. The beam hit a row of massive, rusted gears, casting long, monstrous shadows against the far wall. "I know about the clinic on 5th. I know about the food bank. It doesn't change the law, but I can help you if you stop now." From somewhere high above in the rafters, a voice drifted down, a young, defiant tenor that vibrated with the raw energy of the desperate. "You can't help me, Miller. The system you serve is the one that broke those people in the first place. You're just the janitor cleaning up the mess they made." Elias adjusted his grip on the flashlight. He moved deeper into the warehouse, his senses on high alert. He knew the floorboards here were treacherous, weakened by decades of moisture and neglect. He moved with the practiced caution of a man who had survived 1,000 such buildings. But the Goliath was different. It felt alive, as if the very structure were groaning under the weight of its own decay. "The law isn't perfect, Jax, but it's the only thing keeping the wolves from the door," Elias countered, his eyes scanning the catwalks above. Suddenly, a sound like a thunderclap echoed through the chamber. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a structural support beam, 5 stories up, finally surrendering to the relentless pull of gravity. The sound was followed by a terrifying, high-pitched scream of twisting metal. Elias looked up, his flashlight beam catching the descent of a massive section of the roof. "Jax, move." Elias roared, but the collapse was too fast. The floor beneath Elias's feet, already compromised, buckled under the sudden shock wave of the falling debris. He felt himself falling, a stomach-churning drop into a void of dust and splintering timber. He hit a secondary level 10 feet below, his shoulders screaming in protest as it dislocated on impact. But the worst was yet to come. A secondary beam, dislodged by the primary collapse, tumbled through the air. It was a 6-foot section of reinforced steel, weighing nearly a ton. It struck the concrete floor inches from Elias's head and then shifted, pinning his lower body with the cold, indifferent force of a tombstone. The dust settled slowly, a choking gray fog that tasted of lime and old secrets. Elias tried to draw a breath, but his ribcage felt like it was being squeezed by a giant's hand. He reached for his radio, but his arm wouldn't move. His shoulder was a mess of fire and ice. His flashlight lay several feet away. Its beam pointed uselessly at a pile of rubble. He was alone. He was trapped, and as the warm, iron-scented blood began to soak into the front of his shirt, Elias Miller realized he was dying in the dark. The silence that followed the collapse was more terrifying than the roar of the falling debris. It was a thick, heavy silence that felt like it was pressing against Elias's eardrums. He could hear the faint, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of his own heart, a frantic sound that grew weaker with every passing second. He tried to move his legs, but there was no sensation, only a void where his lower body should be. The weight of the beam was absolute, a mathematical certainty of death. "Help!" He tried to whisper, but the word caught in his throat, choked by a sudden surge of copper-tasting bile. High above him, on a stable section of the third-floor catwalk, Jack stood frozen. The dust was so thick he could barely see his own hands. He had seen the detective fall. He had heard the sickening crunch of the beam meeting the floor. His instinct, honed by years of surviving on the razor's edge of the city, screamed at him to run. The police would be here soon. They would find Miller, and if Jax was anywhere near, he would be the prime suspect in the attempted murder of a police officer. He took a step toward the window. He could see the blurred red and blue lights of the first responders reflecting off the clouds in the distance. They were close, maybe 5 minutes. If Miller was lucky, they would find him in time. But as Jax looked down into the pit of shadows, he knew the truth. 5 minutes was an eternity for a man pinned under a ton of steel. Jax thought about his father. He remembered the cold, sterile hallway of a county hospital, waiting for a doctor who never came because they didn't have the right insurance. He remembered the sound of his father's final, ragged breath, a sound of a man who had worked himself to death only to be discarded like industrial waste. The system had failed his father. The law, represented by men like Miller, had watched it happen. "Run, you idiot!" Jax hissed at himself, his fingers gripping the cold metal of the railing. "He's the enemy. He's the one who wants to put you in a cage." He turned back toward the exit, his heart hammering against his ribs. But then he heard it. It wasn't a scream or a plea. It was a cough, a wet, rattling sound that indicated internal bleeding. It was the sound of a human being reaching the end of their rope. Jack stopped. He closed his eyes, his mind a battlefield of rage and empathy. He thought about the clinics he funded, the people he helped. Could he really call himself a savior if he left a man to die in the dirt just because he wore a badge? Was he a hero, or was he just another predator justified by his own trauma? "Damn it," Jax whispered, a tear carving a clean path through the dust on his cheek. He didn't run for the window. He turned and sprinted back toward the center of the warehouse. He found a rusted maintenance ladder and slid down the rails, the friction burning his palms. He reached the level where Elias lay and began to navigate the treacherous landscape of jagged concrete and twisted rebar. He found the flashlight first. He picked it up and turned the beam toward the center of the wreckage. The light revealed a scene of pure horror. Elias was half buried under a mountain of gray dust and splintered wood, his lower body invisible beneath the massive steel beam. His face was a mask of pale agony, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Miller!" Jax shouted, dropping to his knees beside the detective. Elias's eyes snapped open, unfocused and wild. He saw Jax, and for a second, a spark of the old detective returned. "Run. Kid, floor's unstable." Jax ignored him. He grabbed the edge of beam, his muscles bulging as he tried to lift. It didn't move an inch. He tried again, a guttural roar of effort escaping his throat, but the steel was indifferent to his strength. He looked around frantically, his mind racing through the physics of the situation. "I need a lever," Jax muttered, his eyes landing on a long, heavy iron pipe that had been part of the warehouse's steam system. He scrambled toward the pipe, his fingers clawing at the debris. He dragged the heavy metal back to the beam and looked for a fulcrum. He found a solid chunk of concrete and positioned it near the beam's edge. He shoved the pipe under the steel, his hands slick with sweat and grime. "Hold on, Elias," Jax cried. "I'm going to lift it. When I do, you have to crawl. Do you hear me? You have to move." Miller looked at the boy, a strange expression of pity and respect crossing his face. "No, you's legs are gone. Jules." Jax froze. Elias had called him Jules. It was the name his mother used, the name he hadn't heard since she passed away 5 years ago. How did this cop know? How much had he really looked into Jax's life? "Don't you dare die on me, Miller." Jax screamed, throwing his entire weight onto the iron pipe. "If you die, I go to jail for murder. You hear me? You're my only witness. Lift, you bastard. Lift." The pipe groaned. The concrete fulcrum shifted. Slowly, agonizingly, the massive steel beam began to rise. The sound of metal grinding against concrete was like a physical blow. Jax's face turned a deep purple, the veins in his neck standing out like cords. "Now!" Jax roared. "Move!" If you're enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. Elias didn't move. He couldn't. The weight had been on his body for too long, crushing the nerves and the bone. But he saw the desperation in the boy's eyes, the raw, unfiltered humanity of a thief trying to save his captor. Elias reached out with his one good arm, his fingers clawing at the dusty floor. He dragged himself an inch, 2 inches. The pain was a white-hot explosion in his brain, a roar of agony that drowned out the sound of the rain. "Keep going," Jax pleaded, his voice breaking from the strain. The iron pipe was beginning to bend. The concrete fulcrum was cracking. Just a little more, Elias. "Come on." With a final desperate heave that felt like it was tearing his soul from his body, Elias dragged himself clear. The moment his legs were free, the pipe snapped. The beam slammed back down with a force that shook the entire building, sending a fresh cloud of dust into the air. Jax collapsed beside him, his chest heaving, his hands raw and bleeding. He looked at Elias's legs. They were a mess of shredded fabric and dark, pulsing blood. The detective was drifting again, his face turning a sickly shade of blue. "Stay with me, Elias," Jax whispered, his hands hovering over the wounds. He knew he had to stop the bleeding, but he didn't have any medical supplies. He looked at his own hoodie. It was thick, heavy cotton. He didn't hesitate. He pulled the hoodie over his head and began to tear it into long, jagged strips. He used his teeth to start the tears, his mind focused on a single goal: survival. He wrapped the strips around Elias's thighs, twisting them tight with a piece of rebar he found in the debris. "I'm sorry," Jax whispered as he tightened the tourniquets. Elias let out a sharp, jagged cry of pain before his head fell back and his eyes closed completely. "No, no, no." Jax slapped the detective's cheeks. "Wake up. Look at me. You have to stay awake." The sirens were louder now. They were right outside. Jax could see the flickers of light through the gaps in the warehouse walls. He heard the sound of heavy tires skidding on the wet gravel. He heard the shouting of officers, the barking of AK-9 unit. He looked at the exit, then back at Elias. If he stayed, he was caught. He had a backpack full of incriminating evidence, hard drives from a bank heist, the tools of his trade. He would go to prison for a long, long time. But Elias was dying. If he left now, the paramedics might not find the detective in time in the maze of the warehouse. Jax looked at Elias's hand. The detective's fingers were loosely curled around a small, tarnished silver object that had fallen out his pocket during the struggle. Jax picked it up. It was a St. Jude medal, the patron saint of lost causes. Lost causes, Jax muttered, a bitter smile touching his lips. He stood up and began to shout. He didn't care about the consequences anymore. He didn't care about the cage. Over here! He's over here! Help! Officer down! He shouted until his voice was hoarse, until he saw the beams of a dozen high-powered flashlights cutting through the darkness of the warehouse. He saw the first wave of officers rushing toward them, their guns drawn, their faces twisted in a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Hands in the air. Don't move. Jax slowly raised his blood-stained hands. He looked at the lead officer, a young man who looked like he had never seen a real crime scene in his life. He's under there, Jax said, his voice quiet and steady. He's lost a lot of blood. Get the medics. Now! As the officers tackled Jax to the ground, slamming his face into the cold concrete, he didn't fight back. He watched as the paramedics swarmed over Elias, their voices a chaotic blur of medical jargon and urgency. He saw them lift the detective onto a stretcher, saw the flash of the St. Jude medal in the light of their headlamps. As they dragged Jax toward the exit, his wrists bound by the cold, biting metal to handcuffs, he looked back one last time. He saw the warehouse, the Goliath, standing silent and broken in the rain. He felt a strange sense of peace. He was going to prison, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't running. He was finally standing his ground. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories, and activate the notification bell. The recovery ward of Cook County Hospital smelled of antiseptic, burnt coffee, and the stale, lingering scent of hope deferred. It was a sterile, white-walled purgatory where time was measured not in hours, but in the slow, rhythmic drip of an N4 bag and the steady, haunting beep of a heart monitor. Detective Elias Miller drifted in and out of consciousness for 3 days, his mind a fractured landscape of gray dust and the sound of falling steel. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the Goliath, the weight of the world crushing, the life from his marrow. He could still feel the cold rain on his face and the warmth of his own blood soaking into the dirt. When he finally woke up and stayed awake, the world felt too bright, too sharp. His body was a map of agony, but the center of that pain was a strange, buzzing numbness where his legs used to be active. He looked down and saw the heavy white bandages, the metal pins protruding from his skin like the thorns of a technological crown. He tried to speak, but his voice was a dry rattle. Water? A nurse appeared, her face a mask of professional kindness, and helped him sip through a straw. It felt like liquid diamonds sliding down his parched throat. As the fog in his brain cleared, the memories began to solidify. He remembered the hoodie. He remembered the boy's hands, slick with blood, twisting a piece of rebar into a tourniquet. He remembered the desperate, raw shout. Asterisk, don't you dare die on me, Miller. Asterisk, where's he? Elias rasped, his eyes searching the room as if Jax might be standing in the corner shadows. The young man who brought you in? The nurse asked, pausing as she checked his vitals. He's in the Northside Detention Center, detective. He's being held without bail. The district attorney's office is making a very big deal out of this. They're calling it a kidnapping and attempted murder of a peace officer. Elias felt a surge of cold fury that momentarily overrode his physical pain. Attempted murder? He saved my life. He lifted a ton of steel off me. He could have run, but he stayed. That's not the story they're telling on the news, she replied softly. They found the hard drives in his backpack, the bank heists. To the city, he's just a high-tech thief who got caught and tried to use a wounded cop as a shield. Elias lay back, his breath hitching. He looked at the ceiling, the fluorescent lights flickering in a way that reminded him of the dying flashlight in the warehouse. He was a man who lived by the book, a man who believed that the law was the only thing standing between civilization and the abyss. But the book hadn't saved him in the Goliath. A criminal had. A boy who had every reason to hate him had chosen to become his guardian. The silence of the hospital room was broken by a knock at the door. It was Captain O'Malley, Elias's partner and friend for 15 years. O'Malley looked tired, his suit wrinkled, his eyes reflecting the weight of the department's expectations. "You look like hell, Elias," O'Malley said, pulling up a plastic chair that creaked under his weight. "The docs say you're lucky to be alive. They say you might even walk again, eventually. A miracle, they're calling it." "It wasn't a miracle, Sean," Elias said, his voice regaining some of its gravelly strength. "It was the kid, Jax, Julian, whatever his name is. He didn't let go. He didn't run." O'Malley sighed, looking at his hands. "The DA wants his head on a platter, Elias. They want to show that no one touches a cop and gets away with it. They're using the warehouse collapse as proof that his reckless criminal flight caused your injuries. They're going for the max, 25 to life." "He saved me," Elias repeated, his fingers gripping the bed sheets. "If he hadn't stayed, you'd be planning my funeral right now. You know that, Sean? The paramedics told me the tourniquets were professional. The lockpicking saved us a con that we didn't have." "I know," O'Malley whispered. "But the system is a hungry beast, Elias. And right now, it's looking for a villain to justify your sacrifice. They don't want a hero who breaks the law. They want a criminal who can be blamed for a detective's broken body. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell." For miles away, in a concrete box that smelled of industrial floor wax and human despair, Jack sat on a metal bench. The North Side Detention Center was a symphony of clanging gates and distant, angry shouting, but in Jack's cell it was quiet. He stared at the cinder block wall, his mind retracing the pins and tumblers of 1,000 locks he had broken. But this lock, the legal system, was one he couldn't pick. His hands were still stained. No matter how much he scrubbed them with the thin, lye-heavy soap provided by the jail, he could still see the phantom red of Elias Miller's blood under his fingernails. He closed his eyes, and he could still feel the weight of the iron pipe in his hands, the sensation of his own muscles nearly snapping as he fought against gravity. He was 19 years old, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. He should have been terrified of the 25-year sentence looming over him. He should have been angry at the lawyers who refused to hear his side of the story. But instead, he felt a strange, hollow peace. He had spent his whole life running, hiding behind firewalls and shadows, taken from a world that had taken his father. In the Goliath, he had finally stopped running. He had stood his ground for something other than himself. A guard banged on the bars, the sound like a gunshot in the small space. "Visitor, kid, your court-appointed lawyer, is here. Try not to piss him off. He's the only thing between you and a life sentence." Jack stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He was led through a series of buzzing gates to a small, glass-walled interview room. His lawyer was a man named David Miller, no relation to Elias, a tired-looking public defender whose briefcase was bursting with the weight of too many cases and too little time. "Look, Julian," the lawyer began, spreading files across the table. "The prosecution is offering a plea. 15 years if you plead guilty to all charges, including the aggravated assault on Detective Miller. If we go to trial, they'll bury you. They have the hard drives, they have your DNA at the crime scenes, and they have a crippled hero cop who is the face of the city right now." "He's not a face," Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. "He's a man, and I didn't assault him. I saved him." "It doesn't matter what happened in that warehouse," the lawyer snapped, his eyes flashing with a mix of frustration and pity. "In the eyes of a jury, your criminal actions led to his injury. You led him into a dangerous building. You are responsible for the collapse. The fact that you pulled him out is just mitigating circumstances to them. They'll argue you only did it because you knew you were caught." Jax looked through the glass at the gray hallway. "What does Detective Miller say?" The lawyer hesitated. "He's still in recovery. The DA hasn't let anyone from the defense near him. They're protecting their star witness. They're building a narrative, Julian. A narrative where you are the monster and he is the victim. And in this city, the victim's word is law." "I want to see him," Jack said. "That's impossible. You're a flight risk and he's under police guard." "I want to see him," Jax repeated, his eyes meeting the lawyer's. "He knows the truth. He called me Jules. He knows who I am." The lawyer sighed, packing his papers back into the briefcase. "I'll try to get a statement, but don't hold your breath. The system doesn't like it when the lines get blurred. Kid. They want the black and the white. They don't have room for a thief with a soul. As Jax was led back to his cell, the sound of the gates closing behind him felt different. It wasn't the sound of an end. It was the sound of a heartbeat. He looked at his hands again. They were clean, but they were strong. He had lifted a ton of steel. He could handle a ton of lies. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. Outside the jail and the hospital, Chicago was a city divided. The story of the Goliath collapse had become a media sensation. On one side, the headlines screamed about the shadow thief who had nearly killed a decorated officer. On the other, the underground blogs and community forums in the South Side whispered a different story. They knew Jax. They knew the ghost who had quietly paid for a dozen funerals and saved 3 community gardens from foreclosure. Small protests began to form outside the district attorney's office. People held signs that read, "Jax saved Miller," and asterisk, "The truth is under the rubble." Asterisk, the narrative was cracking, but the authorities held the hammer. They tightened the flow of information, painting Jax's past heists as acts of economic terrorism, rather than the calculated redistributions they were. Inside the hospital, Elias Miller began the grueling process of physical therapy. Every morning, he was wheeled into a room filled with the scent of rubber and sweat. He had to relearn how to stand, how to balance his weight on legs that felt like they were made of glass and fire. The pain was a constant companion, a sharp reminder of the Goliath. But every time he felt like quitting, he remembered Jax's face. He remembered the kid's bloody knuckles. He also remembered his own life. He had spent 20 years arresting boys like Jax. He had seen them as statistics, as failures of character or product of environment. He had never seen them as partners. But in the dark, they had been partners in the most primal sense. They had been 2 men fighting the dark together. "You're pushing too hard, Elias," his therapist warned as he gritted his teeth. "Try to take a single step between the parallel bars." "I have to get to court," Elias gasped, sweat pouring down his face. "The trial starts in 3 weeks. I'm not testifying from a wheelchair. The DA said they could take your deposition here." O'Malley told him during a visit, "You don't have to put yourself through this." "I'm going to that courtroom, Sean," Elias said, his voice hard. "I'm going to look that boy in the eye. And I'm going to make sure the city hears what actually happened in that warehouse." O'Malley looked worried. "The DA is expecting you to be the nail in his coffin, Elias. If you go off script, they'll turn on you. They'll say you're suffering from trauma, from Stockholm Syndrome. They'll protect the department at any cost." "Let them try," Elias replied. He took a step. It was small, agonizing, and shaky, but it was a step. The metal of the bars felt cold under his hands, a familiar cold. It reminded him of the beam. It reminded him of the weight he had to lift. If you're enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The day of the trial arrived with a heavy, gray sky that threatened a repeat of the night of the collapse. The courthouse was a fortress of limestone and security, swarmed by news crews and protesters. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the nervous energy of a high-profile case. Jax sat at the defense table, wearing a suit that was a size too large, his hair cut short, his face pale but composed. He looked smaller in the courtroom, less like a shadow thief and more like a boy who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. He didn't look at the gallery. He kept his eyes on the judge's bench. The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman named Sarah Jenkins, began her opening statement. Her voice was like a whip, cracking through the silence of the room. She painted a picture of a calculated criminal, a man who uses intellect to prey on the city's institutions. She spoke of the night of the chase not as a tragedy, but as a direct result of Jax's malignant disregard for human life. "He led Detective Miller into a death trap," Jenkins declared, pointing a finger at Jax. "He knew that building was unstable. He used it as a weapon, and when the building did what it was destined to do, he stood over a dying hero and only helped because he knew his escape was cut off. This was not an act of mercy. It was an act of self-preservation." Jax's lawyer tried his best, speaking of the unlikely hero and the miracle of the Goliath, but the jury looked skeptical. They saw the hard drives on the evidence table. They saw the criminal record. They were waiting for the one thing that mattered, the testimony of the victim. A murmur went through the room as the back doors opened. The sound of a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed in the marble hallway. Asterisk thud. Step. Thud. Step. Asterisk. Elias Miller walked into the courtroom. He wasn't in a wheelchair. He was leaning heavily on a dark wooden cane, his face set in a mask of grim determination. Every step was a battle, his legs shaking under the weight of the suit, but he didn't falter. He walked to the witness stand, the silence of the room so absolute you could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. He took the oath, his voice steady and deep. He sat down, his cane resting against the railing. He finally looked at Jax. For a long moment, the two men locked eyes. There was no anger in Elias's gaze, only a profound, weary recognition. Detective Miller, the prosecutor began, her voice softening into a tone of simulated empathy. Can you tell the court, in your own words, what happened the night of October 14th? Elias took a breath. He could smell the antiseptic of the hospital, the dust of the warehouse, and the faint scent of rain that clung to the spectators' coats. He looked at the jury, 12 ordinary people who held a boy's life in their hands. I was chasing a suspect, Elias began. I followed him into the Goliath warehouse. It was a mistake. I knew the building was dangerous, but I was focused on the collar. I was focused on the law. He described the collapse, the roar, the darkness, the sudden, absolute weight of the beam. He described the pain, the cold, and the certainty that he was going to die. He spoke of the fear, a fear he had never admitted to in 20 years on the force. And then, Sarah Jenkins prompted, the defendant approached you. Did he threaten you? Did he try to use your condition to facilitate his escape? Elias paused. He looked at the prosecutor, then back at Jax. No, he said, the word ringing out like a bell. He didn't threaten me. He stayed. He had a clear path to the roof. He could have been gone in 30 seconds. Instead, he came down into the wreckage. He risked his life as the ceiling was coming down to lift a ton of steel off my body. The prosecutor's smile faltered. But Detective, surely he only did so because he knew backup was. He didn't know anything. Elias barked, his hand slamming onto the railing. He didn't have a radio. All he had was a choice. And he chose to save a man who had spent months trying to hunt him down. He used his bare hands and a piece of scrap iron to give me a second chance. He stayed with me. He talked to me. He kept me awake when the darkness was pulling me under. The courtroom was electric. The reporters were scribbling furiously. The jury was leaning forward, their skepticism replaced by a budding wonder. He called me Jules, Elias whispered, his voice cracking. He told me about his mother. He treated me like a human being, not a badge. And when the police finally arrived, he didn't run. He shouted for them to help me. He put his own hands in cuffs so that I could get to a stretcher. If you're enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. The prosecution tried to pivot, to bring the focus back to the stolen hard drives and the digital crimes. But the energy in the room had shifted irrevocably. Elias Miller, the hero of Chicago, had just dismantled the narrative of the monster thief. When it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, Jax's lawyer stood up slowly. Detective Miller, in your professional opinion, after 25 years on the force, is Julian a threat to the city? Elias looked at Jax. He saw the boy who had survived the shadows, the boy who had used his brilliance to help the forgotten. He saw the partner who had fought the Goliath beside him. The law says he's a criminal, Elias said, his voice echoing in the rafters. But the law is a cold thing. It doesn't account for the soul. Julian didn't just save my life that night. He saved his own. He showed me that a hero isn't defined by a badge or a clean record. A hero is defined by what they do when the world is falling apart. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. Julian is not a threat. He is a man who was lost, and he found his way back in the dark. If you send him to prison for 25 years, you aren't protecting the city. You're just burying the best thing this city has produced in a long time. The jury went into deliberations that afternoon. The city held its breath. The protests outside grew larger, but they were no longer angry. They were hopeful. The story of the cop and the thief had become a modern parable of redemption. 3 days later, the verdict came back. Not guilty on the charges of aggravated assault and kidnapping. Guilty on the charges of grand larceny and unauthorized computer access. The judge, a man who had seen 1,000 faces of crime, looked at Jax. "Julian, the law requires me to sentence you for your financial crimes. You stole millions of dollars. But the law also allows me to consider your extraordinary actions in the Goliath. You saved a life at the risk of your own. You showed a character that this court rarely sees." The sentence was 5 years, a fraction of what the prosecution had wanted. And with time served and a recommendation for an accelerated rehabilitation program, Jax would be out in 3. As he was being let out of the courtroom, Elias Miller stood at the back. He didn't say anything. He just raised his cane in a silent salute. Jax nodded, a single tear falling down his cheek. The chase was over. The debt was acknowledged. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell. 3 years later, the Chicago sun was warm and bright, reflecting off the glass towers of the Loop. Elias Miller, now retired from the force but serving as a consultant for high-security infrastructure, stood outside the gates of the Joliet Correctional Center. He walked with a slight limp, but the cane was gone. He was a man who had reclaimed his life, but he had never forgotten the man who had given it back to him. The gates buzzed open. A young man stepped out into the light. He was older, his face leaner, his eyes filled with a new kind of quiet strength. He was carrying a small duffel bag and a folder containing a certificate of completion for a degree in cybersecurity. "You're late," Jax said, a smirk playing on his lips. "The traffic on the I-90 is a crime in itself." Elias grunted, reaching out to take the boy's bag. They walked to Elias's car, the same unmarked sedan, though it was cleaner now. As they drove toward the city, the silence between them was comfortable, the silence of 2 men who had shared the ultimate secret. "So," Elias said as they crossed the bridge into the south side, "there's a firm in the West Loop. They specialize in white-hat hacking. They test the defenses of major banks to make sure guys like you can't get in. The owner is an old friend of mine. He's looking for a lead analyst." Jax looked at the skyline, the city he had once haunted as a ghost. "You think they'll hire an ex-con?" "I think they'll hire the man who lifted a ton of steel off a detective," Elias said. "I gave them my word. And in this city, my word still means something." They pulled up to a small community center on 5th Street, the same one Jax had funded with stolen money years ago. It was thriving now, filled with the sound of children playing and the hum of a new computer lab. Elias had used his retirement fund and a city grant to keep it alive while Jax was away. Jax stepped out of the car, his breath hitching as he saw the sign, the Vance Miller Community Center. "You kept it going," Jax whispered. "We kept it going," Elias corrected him. As they walked into the building together, the cop and the thief, the unlikely partners who had survived the Goliath, the world felt a little less cold. They had proven that destiny doesn't just happen. It's something you build, one choice at a time. They had shown that even in a city of stone and steel, the human heart is the strongest structure of all. The Goliath had fallen, but from its ruins, something indestructible had grown. A friendship forged in the dark, a redemption written in the light, and a sovereign destiny that proved that no matter how far you run, you can always find your way back if you're brave enough to stop and help a dying man in the rain. If you are enjoying, remember to subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next stories and activate the notification bell.